Voices in the Corner. This is a story that my dad told me many of times, and ID thought I'd share it. Back in 1966, when my dad was little, around 13 or 14, he started reading what I like to call no-no books, black magic type evil books. One night around 2, 3 in the morning, my dad got up to go to the toilet. When he came out of the bathroom, he heard what sounded like whispers coming from his room. At first, he thought it might have been my grandparents talking in their room. But as he sat and listened, he noticed it was coming from the opposite side of the room, from where his parents' room would have been. He eventually managed to pinpoint where it was coming from, the upper corner where the walls and ceiling meet. He told me he couldn't recognize the language the voices were speaking. He said it sounded like a dead language, one not spoken for 1,000 years. The voices also came through with a heavy hint of static, like an old radio station that's hardly in range. Freaked out, he shouted for my grandfather. My grandfather opened his door and froze. "Who's in here with you?" my grandfather asked. "I don't know," my dad said, pointing to the corner of the room. At this point, the whispers had evolved into normal speaking volume. My grandfather walked in and listened for a moment. "What have you been doing in here?" he asked my dad. Without speaking, my dad pointed to a book beside his bed. My grandfather, a pastor at their church, went pale. He grabbed the book with one hand, and his cross he wore around his neck in the other. They both went down into the living room, where my grandfather built a little fire in their fireplace. At this point, my grandmother had come out in her robe. She asked, "What's going on?" "Don, my dad, I told you no TV this late." My grandfather looked at his wife in horror and said, "Honey, that's not the TV." Once the logs in the fireplace began to burn, my grandfather tossed the book inside and waited. Once the book began to catch fire, the voices turned to screams that rattled the windows. They lasted about 7 seconds before everything went silent. I asked my grandfather about this story. He would always cut me off and snap, "We do not talk about that night, period." My grandmother said pretty much the same thing, only nicer in her granny way. My dad, though, has told me this story a dozen times, and it always captivated me. What were those voices? What were they saying? Was my dad close to opening up some kind of portal? I don't know, but I do know he never picked up a no-no book again.